Hi everyone, I'm Miss Collins, and this is my dog Norman. Hi buddy. We're going to be reading Nuts to You by Lynn Ray Perkins. Chapter 8. Squirrels slumbered in the warm nest of dried grasses, but their piece of the world was tilting toward winter, and the air outside turned icy. Filmy dew stiffened into frost around each leaf and twig. When the sun rose, the frozen crystals sparkled like a million diamonds, but only for a moment. Sunlight melted the diamonds into water, and the frosty air lost its bite. The autumn trees glowed golden. Around the grove, creatures of the night grew drowsy, blinked, then closed their eyes, just like Norman. The creatures of the day woke up, felt a little hungry, called out to one another. As Jed awoke, his dreams evaporated. They left behind a sticky feeling, but he willed it away. He counted his blessings on his fingers. 1, not eaten by the hawk. 2, landed in a foreign but friendly country. 3, there is food. He had 2 fingers left, but that was enough, he figured, for starters. There was a chattering close by, and Jed listened, getting his ears used to the reddish accent again before jumping into the day. He soon realized that they were talking about him. Anyone as can escape from the hawk, well, there is a thing I have not heard before, said a high and scratchy voice. Are you thinking it's true then? Said another lower voice. Well, if it is, maybe you should be king or something, said the first. Teller of tales, maybe, said the second. King or something like that, said the high voice. Governor, maybe, or hero. Being lucky don't make you a hero. It does if you ax me. Lucky's catchy. Nobody axed you, though, did they? The voices moved out of Jed's hearing, and he smiled. It was going to be an interesting day. He took a deep breath, stepped outside, and looked around, and thought just for an instant that he saw 2 gray squirrels through the gap between the branches. Not any 2 gray squirrels, but his best friends, Chai and Sutsu. He blinked his eyes. He rubbed with his paws. Then he looked again. Sure enough, the gray squirrels were gone. His imagination? I didn't know I was such a sap, he said to himself. Before he could think about it further, 3 reddish squirrels joined him on his limb. They wanted to hear again the story of how he escaped from the hawk. Tell about the wolf, said the squirrel called Pf. There wasn't no wolf, said Sam. Just tell him then. How'd you escape and all? But first, the snatching bit. The snatching bit, it's the start of it. They settled themselves into the nearby branches to listen. It's nice when someone wants to hear your story, especially when you're a strange new place. As Jed told it, more of the reddish squirrels drew close. Some of them shouted prompts when they thought he might be leaving something out. Maybe it was because they were sitting so still, mostly, that they heard the rubbing sound start up in the distance. It was an unnatural sound, which rose and fell. Jed paused, and they all listened. Maybe it's all of us there, said Chuck, and we don't pay no mind. They listened for a moment more, but no one could identify it. They decided it was too far away to worry about it. Tell us that scaping part, urged Sam. That's the best part. Teach us the secret trick, said Pip. The escaping from this hawk trick. It wasn't a trick exactly, Jed told him. It was remembering everything I knew about hawks. It was trying to stay calm and focused. And, he added honestly, a lot of it was pure luck. The trick, they called out. Teach us the trick. They began to chant. The trick, teach us all the trick. The thumps were clapping and foot stomping, and it wasn't much of a sound, just a beat. Then some of the squirrels began to feel that point wasn't so much the trick, but that Jed wasn't sharing, and that second chant went up, mingling with the first. Share, share. Show us all how to do that slippy thing that helped you escape. Their hearts were in the right place, but they weren't very good at rhythm or rhyming. Even so, they kept at it, and Jed could see there was no getting out of it. He jumped to the ground, and everyone followed. He told them to form a circle around him. First, they did some stretches. They took deep breaths. After that, he instructed them to first tense up all their muscles and then relax them. A crash course in high tree. Like water, he kept saying. Make your muscles like water and you can slip through the cracks. The squirrels swayed and wobbled as they tried to figure out how to be like water. Do you mean be as raindrops or be as Mary Brook? Asked Sam. As she was kicking up her hind feet and landing on her bum. It'll have to be an awful big crack, she said. I ain't slipping through nothing just yet. Oh, I'm Sweet Pond, said Shrika, who had curled up into a circle on the ground. She yawned and then started to laugh. I'll be a pond too then, said Looks safer. Chuck concentrated on the tensing up, then relaxing exercise. He ignored the bunny hop line of bouncing squirrels that was forming. Bunch of twits, he muttered. We are but mere drops in the mighty stream, Sam sang out from the hopping queue. Things were falling apart fast. Jed didn't really care, but he thought he'd try to at least wrap it all up. Okay, he shouted. The bouncing line was traveling in a circle around him, and he was able to get everyone to turn and face him again. One last time, he said. We'll do it all together. And don't get up until I tell you. 1, 2, 3. Be like water. All the squirrels fell to the ground, limp. A couple of them fell asleep. It was a good thing no hawk was in the vicinity. It would have been an all-you-can-eat squirrel buffet. After a few minutes, the squirrels started quivering with suppressed laughter. Then Shrika jumped up and said, I can do it now, all done! And off she went. That was it. Off they all went. But as they went about their business, squirreling through the trees and gathering seeds and whatnot, they turned to high tree lesson into a game. One of them would shout, Be like water! And they would all fall from their branches and drop through the air. The game was to stay limp for as long as possible before flipping and landing on your feet. The rumbling was closer now. It was a sound, and it was also a vibration. It was like thunder, except it didn't start and stop. It just kept going. It did go up and down, sort of. No one knew what quite to make of it. The conversation about it happened in passing, bits and snatches. Some squirrels wondered if it was an unusual new type of weather on the way, maybe a storm. Others favored the idea that it was a horrible beast of some kind. A storm beast, said Sam, to anyone who would listen. Neither is my Top's favorite. And or mine, said all their shaking heads. Unregardless, counseled Chuck, what's the best is? To avoid lots of food stashed and lots of nooks. Everyone agreed with that too. So they kept on with their gathering, and as long as they were gathering seeds, you might as well play. Be like water! Squirrels fell from the trees like overripe pine cones. Jed had to laugh. Everyone was laughing and falling. Meanwhile, a little earlier and a little ways off, Tut-Tut and Chai had crawled from their makeshift dray. Bits of seeds and stems littered their fur. They took a few cautious steps and sniffed at the crisp autumn air. All around, leaves glowed green, golden, vermilion, scarlet, lemony, and amber. Far above was a hazy blue sky. The morning was glorious. And yet, said Chai, something doesn't feel right. And just that we're just not at home, said Tut-Tut. I don't know, Chai, said Chai. I think there's more than that. Like, what's with the rumbling noise? I don't know, said Tut-Tut. Maybe it just does that here. I don't like it, grumbled Chai. He was cranky. He had expected Tut-Tut to wake up and realize that it was time to go home. Instead, she was all refreshed and ready to go on. Lighten up, she said. I'm hungry, though. Let's find some breakfast. She plucked one of the seeds clinging from her fur, popped it into her mouth, and made a face. Ugh! Don't eat this kind, she said, pulling another one off and holding it up for Chai to see. She shook her paw to get rid of it. It had little barbs that helped stick to things like fur. They headed down to the underbrush to search for food. What they wanted was nuts, specifically acorns. But it seemed this wasn't an okay part of the forest, so they foraged for seeds and they found some dried up berries. Maybe you've had the experience of waking up in a place where breakfast is different from what you are used to. Let's say your traditional breakfast food is leftover pizza, and you wake up where they eat hard-boiled eggs, or seaweed, or oatmeal, or termites, or vice versa. It can throw you off. So Chai and Tut-Tut found some food, but there was a part inside each of them. It was the mouth, the taste buds, stomach-wise, they were fine, that was still waiting for the acorns to arrive. And the rumbling noise. It was bothering both of them, no matter what Tut-Tut said. Nevertheless, they began their search. Yesterday, they had at least had something to aim for. Now it was hard to know where to begin. They climbed to the closest tree and made their way along the first bough, scanning to the right and to the left. The branches were strangely empty. I wonder where all the squirrels are, said Tut-Tut. Someplace with better food is my guess, said Chai. And then, without warning, he came to a halt. Tut-Tut nearly crashed into them. What are you doing? She said. Why did you stop? Look, he said softly. I found where all the squirrels are. Tut-Tut followed his gaze to a strange and fearful sight. Oh, she gasped. Looking down through a gap in the foliage, they saw a circle of squirrels lying lifeless on the earth below, their light bellies faced up, their paws in the air. There was no blood. There were no signs of a fight. "What do you think?" said Chai. "Bad mushrooms, maybe?" "I guess we better be careful what we eat," said Tsutsut. She remembered their weird breakfast. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Okay," said Chai, "so far." They turned away from the horrible scene and moved on. Before long, squirrels began to appear in the trees. These squirrels seemed very much alive. They were smallish and reddish, and it was hard to make out what they were chatting about. Then, all at once, one of them shouted something about the water and fell, along with his companion, from the tree. Then it happened again. And again. The two friends exchanged glances. "I think we better be careful what we drink, too," said Tsutsut. "At least it should be easy to spot Jed," she thought to herself, "since he is gray, and there are so many red ones." And as if her thought had made it happen, a gray squirrel darted across a branch a few yards ahead of her. "Jed!" she cried out. The gray squirrel froze. He knew that voice. But he was sure he was homesick. Imagination was playing tricks on him again. He told himself he would not even look. He took a step forward and he whisked his tail, a nervous gesture. That did it. Tsutsut knew that the tail whisk like she knew her own paw. "Jed!" she called again. "It's me, Tsutsut!" Jed could not help himself. He turned and looked and saw only Tsutsut. Not only Tsutsut, but Chai. 3 hearts jumped for joy. 3 pairs of shiny black eyes looked from one another in a happy disbelief. They started toward one another. But at that instant, the rumbling, which had been growing even louder and closer, exploded into an ear-splitting racket of grinding and whining and cracking. And before they could even step onto the branch that crossed between them, it shuddered and dropped right out of sight. Oh no. Norman. What is going to happen, Norman? Fell to the earth with crack and a thud. Another higher branch fell, then another. By the time the 3rd branch fell, they were gone, turning, running, like every nearby creature. Running, flying, creeping, whatever they had to do to get away from whatever it was. No one stopped to see if the noise was storm or beast. There was only scattering, as chunks of trees fell through the air, scattering to where your ears were not blasted, to where the forest still held together. They scattered, with no thought of anything, of any other creature, friend or foe. No thought but escape. Behind them, the tremendous racket went on. It was loud as thunderclap, but a thunderclap is brief. It's there and gone. This loudness moved in and stayed, and it was taking the forest apart piece by piece. The friendly tangles of the grove were slashed out of the air, leaving a great raw emptiness. Amid screaming flashes of silver, homes and highways crashed to the ground, where they piled up in heaps of wreckage. There was nothing to do but run, escape, scatter. Chapter 9. There were a few creatures who did not scatter. Insects, burrowers. An ancient mink, so old that he was beginning to think he might be immortal, looked out from his hole, shook his head, and went back inside. The blue jays hopped or flew just beyond the tumult and screamed back at it. A few brave and curious souls ran only a little way before turning around to try and figure out what it was they were running from. Tsutsut peered from behind the trunk of an ironwood tree. She saw humans, but she had seen them before. Not up in the trees, though. She crawled around the trunk onto a limb and stood watching, paws over her ears, trying to make sense of it. At first, she could catch only glimpses of humans. But as limbs dropped away, she saw that the grinding, awful racket was coming from something each of them held in their hands. Was it alive? Tsutsut couldn't locate its face, but it was chewing through branches. Chewing, but not eating, like some bizarre type of beaver. The vibrations jittered through her foot pads. Her front paws were falling asleep from holding them up over her ears, but she couldn't put them down. The noise was unbearable. Tsutsut looked away from the sunlit humans and their beaver tree chewers into the shady forest. She couldn't see a thing at first. Where was Chai? Where was Jed? Surely not far. But which way had they run? Her eyes were starting to adjust, and then sudden quiet made her turn again to the place where the grove had been. She squinted at the brightness. The humans were dropping to the ground. Noise erupted again as they used the tree chewers to gnaw the tree parts into even smaller bits, which they arranged into piles. They weren't making nests for themselves. There were spaces in them that a squirrel could crawl into, but a human would never be able to fit. What's that about? Tsutsut murmured. She alternated between watching with a morbid fascination and scanning for Jed and Chai. Where were they? She felt sure they would find her, but she wished they would do it soon. The deafening din abruptly ended. The sound of wood falling on wood could be heard, and the voices of the humans. After a time, when it seemed that a relative quiet might last, those creatures who had scattered less distantly began to make their way back. Cautiously, they crept to the chewed-off edge of the livable world. Norman, I'm on the edge of my seat. All right, chapter 10, No Time to Lose. Norman, are you ready? It's going to get good. There were 3 of the humans. They were eating. It had to be said that their food smelled pretty good. Their voices rose and fell in conversation and laughter. The tree chewers rested nearby. I wonder what tree chewers are. Their words sounded like gibberish, but Tsutsut listened to the sounds they were making. Now that it was quiet, they spoke calmly to one another, as if nothing had happened. A stray breezelet lifted an intoxicating scent into her nose. It was both sweet and savory, both nutty and new. It was irresistible and maybe even magical, because without even knowing how it happened, she found herself down on the ground, within harvesting distance. Whoa, she thought. How did this happen? She froze, hoping they had not seen her. but one of them turned and looked right into her eyes and spoke. Blah, 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 it said. The other two turned their heads then, and now they were all watching her. Blah, 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 said one of them. The first one spoke, again, to Tzotzit. Blah, 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 it asked. It tore off a bit of its food and tossed it toward her, gently, and it landed at her feet. The aroma was overpowering. Tzotzit looked at the human, then at the others. The one that had tossed his food took another bite, and while still chewing said, blah, 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 blah. Tzotzit took the bite of food in her mouth and ran to the nearest tree, up the trunk, onto the highest safe limb. Blah, 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 one of them called after her, and then laughter. Her heart was racing, and she took the food in her paws while she calmed herself. She took a deep, slow breath in, out. She tried to empty her mind. While her mind was emptying, her paws lifted the food to her mouth, and she bit into it. Oh my. Wow. It was delicious. What was this? Brown, creamy stuff. She had never tasted anything quite like it. She licked at her paw where some of the stuff had stuck. She looked back down at the humans. What were they up to? She didn't like the hawks, and she didn't like the wolves, but she understood them. This was more confusing. With a fluttering of wings, a young screech owl settled down next to her. Look at them, screeched the angry bird. Hoodlums, barbarians. She blinked in the unfiltered sunlight. She had been sleeping, though poorly, when her home was split into two. What kind of wild beasts are they? She sputtered. Maybe they will build some kind of new nest now, said Tzotzit. Maybe the destruction is over. No, said a familiar voice to the other side of her. Tzotzit whipped around. It was Jed! Jed, she cried. Where have you been? What took you so long? Where's Chai? Before he could answer, she hugged him hard around his middle. I'm just so glad to see you, she said. Half into his fur, Jed couldn't help laughing. He had no good news. I haven't seen Chai, he said. Not yet, and I don't think it's over. The humans aren't finished. They're going to keep going as soon as they've eaten. Look. Tzotzit looked where he was pointing and saw that it wasn't just grove that had been dismantled. There was a long furrow of empty air as far as she could see. Empty, that is, except for the buzz paths and the frozen spider webs. They're making a desert all along the buzz paths, said Jed. Why are they doing that? Said Tzotzit. What for? Jed shrugged. Beats me, he said. Who knows? They're doing it because they're idiots, said the screech owl. But at least they will move on now and leave us alone. She fluffed up, resettled, then swiveled her head around to look at the forest behind her. I only hope all the good cavities aren't already taken, she said. Our situation is a little different, Tzotzit said thoughtfully. She couldn't believe that within minutes of sharing food with a human, she was having a conversation with an owl. Screech owls were small and did not eat squirrels most of the time, but you didn't talk with them. That's what disasters do sometimes. They throw us together with those who are adversaries, who play for different teams. For a short time, a common enemy dissolves our differences and makes us realize what we share. until someone gets hungry. Tut-Tut thought about what Jed had said. A desert all along the buzz paths? If that was true, then their own home was peril. We're from further on up the buzz path, she said. Our families... Her voice broke, and she hid her face in her paws. She had been brave so far, but saying those words out loud opened a floodgate inside of her. How blithely she had left them all behind, but she had never planned to leave them forever. And what would happen now? Her shoulders shook. Jed looked at her in surprise. He hadn't made the connection yet between the buzz path and the unexpected appearance of his friends. Wait, he said. You mean these are all the same buzz paths? Our buzz paths? Is that how you guys found me? Tut-Tut nodded, her face still buried. I climbed to the treetop, she whispered. I watched you fall from the hawk. I counted the objects. Well, of course, thought Jed. Everything had happened so fast. Events had tumbled over him helter-skelter. He hadn't had time to make sense of them, but now he could see it. Of course it was the buzz paths. How else could Chai and Tut-Tut ever have found him? Tut-Tut was weeping quietly. Jed took her paw and squeezed it. It's okay, he said. Don't cry. Why not? Asked Tut-Tut in a quavering voice. It was a good question. Jed didn't have the answer, except maybe because if you keep crying, I might cry too. Instead, he asked gently, how many objects were there? How far did you come? He asked because he wanted to know, but also because sometimes getting someone who is upset to think about numbers can help them feel calm. 3, sobbed Tut-Tut. 3 objects. She began to sob harder. The calming by numbers wasn't working yet. The screech owl turned her head sideways to observe them. There's no use in blubbering, she said. Get on with it. Find a hole. Look for food. She fluttered to the next limb. It is what it is, they all heard her say. Then another rustle of wings, and more distantly, move on. Get a grip. Deal with it. Tut-Tut's sobs were subsiding, but she was still distressed. You move on, she muttered. Stupid owl. Oh, sorry. I guess that was redundant. So much for interspecies harmony. Think of it this way, said Jed. It's really lucky that we're here right now, that we saw all of this, because we can go back home and warn everyone. But we have to go now. There's no time to lose. This had just popped into his head, and he'd only said it for something to say. But it was a sensible idea, and it shone like a ray of sunlight that finds its way back into a dark cave. The light showed Tut-Tut a path out of her despair. Because she was a creature of action, she wiped at her eyes with the back of her paws. She squared her shoulders. Okay, she said. What about Chai, though? We have to find him. She turned and scanned the trees. Right, said Jed. Absolutely. We have to find Chai. He didn't know how on earth they could do that. But maybe the answer to that would pop into his head, too.